Hello, everybody. My guest today is Dr. Dan Stiver. He is a professor at Logsdon Theological Seminary in Abilene. He's the author of several books. He's a world-renowned scholar and very respected, at least by me. And he shepherded me through grad school and through the thesis writing process when I was there at Logsdon. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Stiver.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I remember well your thesis, and part of it was one of those great confluence of interest where what you did was helpful to me and right down the alley of what I was interested in as well. So that was very good.
Yeah, so your areas of expertise are very big picture, right? Like you spend a lot of time in your professional career and my guess is in your personal life thinking about things like hermeneutics and epistemology and sort of like the framework for how we approach spiritual issues. And so I think that a concern about the big picture is probably something that we share. And I know I was doing a little bit of hand wringing and fretting about the state of the church in 2018 when I was working on my thesis. Um, and unfortunately, I think in the last year or so, a lot of what I was worried about kind of proved to be correct, just based on how we've seen things go. So the the last time I saw you or engaged with any of your stuff, you were doing a lecture at the Society for Ricoeur Studies in the fall, and you presented a paper called "Bad Hermeneutics Are Killing Us Literally," where you talked about how a poor interpretation of the Bible was actually setting up the national dialogue in a way that was causing violence and causing like the impossibility of reconciliation between different groups in our country. I wanted to kind of check in with you on that and ask how the events of January really drove that home for you, and how your thinking is kind of adapted to more recent events.
Well, like you, unfortunately, I feel like some of those concerns about the problematic state of our country are discussions, not just the country, but discussions among Christians,
Yeah.
discussions among evangelicals, conservative Christians, Baptists, has been confirmed, and that it's not going well, and it's hard to see any easy answers right now.
Yeah.
I talked further along the lines of that address later with another Zoom kind of meeting with the Ricoeur Society, or just anyone that was interested. I'm supposed to talk again later toward the fall along those lines. And I think the thing that might be helpful to people is, one, is realize our problems are not just hermeneutics.
Right.
There are other problems, but they meld together. They're very interwoven. And one of the things that became clear to me in looking at that, and actually began a few years ago, was seeing how 4 centuries of slavery, essentially, or 4 centuries of racism, several centuries of slavery, then another almost 100 years of Jim Crow laws, among conservative Christians who were the vanguard, the leaders, the dominant group doing that.
Yeah.
That you can't do that without some effect. And it had probably many effects. But one of the effects is what it looks like is it made it very easy to manipulate scripture to fit one's confirmation bias. And you can imagine why that would be the case, because I think most of us, at least now, even very conservative Christians, don't think racism or slavery, especially, is not really promoted or affirmed in the Bible. So for centuries, people, very conservative Christians, had to figure out a way that it could.
Yeah.
And they could live with themselves, that they could have good consciences. And when you look at the way the Bible is interpreted that way, then you begin to see all these little ways that one is able to really not follow good hermeneutical principles like you and people all over the country learn in seminaries or in religion classes. It's a way of avoiding good hermeneutical principles and pretty much finding what you want without worrying about being contradicted somewhere else in the Bible. And it's not just issues of race, you can apply it to many other issues. And I've argued with people, you could apply it, let's say, in a more liberal way as well.
Sure.
Just find what you want, run with that, and not really wrestle with scripture.
Yeah. How fair is it to say that this conflict and even the political debate over those issues for the last several centuries have at least happened in the arena of scripture?
Well, it's very significant. The point that Mark Knoll, I referred to him in that paper, very prominent evangelical church historian. He points out that at the time of the Civil War, before the Civil War, the debate was really about the Bible. The Bible was a dominant force in the whole society. And what he was saying is almost everybody shared a common hermeneutic. And using that hermeneutic made it almost impossible for the anti-slavery group to argue against the pro-slavery group. So he pretty much argues that the pro-slavery advocates won the biblical battle, hands down.
And for people who aren't aware, the roots of like very strict biblical literalism are kind of tied up in that, right? Because there's not that single Bible verse that says, "Thou shalt not own slaves." And so the pro-slavery advocates were leaning more and more into that kind of show me that singular verse style of biblical interpretation, and it left the anti-slavery folks with a lot of work to do to try to explain from scripture why slavery was a bad idea. And in the end, I think in your paper you talk about a lot of the economic incentives that went into keeping slavery going. And so in the end, there were cultural and economic incentives that actually influenced the way that we interpret the Bible because it made it more convenient to be more literalist and more rigid at the time.
And if you have a hermeneutic like that, it's real convenient.
Yeah, right.
If you had a better hermeneutic, it would be more difficult. And as you know, some issues are not that difficult in the Bible.
Yeah.
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
Love your enemy. I think of them. They're very hard to do sometimes. They're not that hard to understand. They're very hard to do. But there are some things that are really complicated and difficult. And if one side is coming with what they see as a very simple statement, and you're coming back with some complex issues, looking at this verse and that verse, and this context and that context, you can lose the argument right off the bat.
Yeah. So if poor Bible interpretation was a weapon that was used to get us to the place where we are, do you think better Bible interpretation can be a force for healing to kind of lead us to a better place?
Yes, very, very much so. Again, it's not the only thing.
Right.
One has to have goodwill and a desire to follow the Bible, and behind that to follow Christ, follow God, follow the Spirit. But it surely can help, because I think there are a lot of people, especially among more conservative Christians, and I count myself as one like this as I was growing up, and still in the wider scheme of things, people would see me as pretty conservative. The Bible really matters. And if they think the Bible is teaching something, even if it runs against their instinct, in a way, their spirit, it's hard to get past that. It's hard to get around it. And so if I think for many, if they can become aware that at least there are other ways of interpreting it, there are other good interpretations. They're not locked in to one that just maybe feels very wrong to them,
Yeah.
but it's the Bible. So, in our language and our message is often, well, don't trust your emotions, just go with the Bible, even if it hurts, even if it,
Yeah.
deny yourself. So I think it really can help, especially if you can show that actually there are some very poor interpretations, very bad interpretations.
Right.
They don't have much to say for themselves. That can really free people.
Yeah.
I mean, I get that a lot from students, and you probably have too, is people, they are bothered. There are things that
Yeah.
bother them about what's going on in the church or what they've been taught. And it's liberating
Yeah.
to find, well, there was something in me that was not comfortable with that all the way along, and I'm really glad to find I'm not stuck in a sense.
Right.
Something that's very uncomfortable.
And that there are different ways of reading the Bible and applying the Bible to different situations, and that part of the wisdom of using the Bible isn't just knowing what it says, but also knowing how to use it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things that ties in maybe with your audience on spirituality and mysticism, it's one of the difficult things is in the New Testament, both Jesus and Paul talk about and demonstrate following the spirit of the law.
Yeah.
Rather than the letter of the law.
That's so much harder.
It is harder.
Yeah.
It's harder to figure it out, and then it's harder to settle disputes.
Right.
Because
or allocate authority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's often a judgment. It's an all things considered judgment. It's a feel, you might say, a sense of the Spirit of God moving through the Bible. But it's very clear in the New Testament, that's it. And what we often do is we fall back to the letter of the law. That's what Jesus had to fight as much as anything.
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite examples of that is Acts 15, when they write the letter to the Jewish congregation in Jerusalem, writes the letter to the Gentile churches, and they say, "It seemed good to us and to the Spirit to impose no more requirements on you." And that word "seem" is so
it's good.
it's so flexible, and it runs so counter to sort of our authoritarian ideas about what religion even is. To say, we were praying about this and we were thinking about it, and this is what seems good for now. So why don't you guys try this for a while and kind of see how it goes? It's not the image of big institutions like the church that most people have in mind.
And often this particular hermeneutic, literalist hermeneutic or biblicist hermeneutic, it's called, this implies that it is pretty easy.
Yeah.
And there is a very clear, definite answer typically. And then I think the thing that really makes it difficult was the idea. They took a very good Reformation principle of what's called the perspicuity of Scripture, or the clarity of Scripture, by which they meant the basic message is pretty clear.
Yeah.
And as Mark Noll and others argue, in the American scene, the American ethos of democracy and literacy, and everyone is an expert and everyone has a say, it promoted a way of going to the Bible, and until you find something that's clear to you.
Yeah.
And if it's clear, that's it.
Right.
And there, along with the assumption that the Bible is something of a flat Bible, everywhere it's pretty much the same message without much complexity. So then you have it. If you find something that seems clear to you, that the Bible's affirming slavery, you find it in the verse, you don't even have to look at the rest of the Bible.
Right.
Because it has to agree if it's clear.
Yeah.
And then that makes it almost impossible to discuss with others or debate with others about the meaning, because you have the meaning. And if they don't, there's something wrong with them, is the usual thing that we think.
Or they're opposing the word of God.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is about it's so tempting, even as a pastor and as you're trying to disciple people, to let the public conversation decide even the questions that you ask of the Bible, because that obviously matters a lot when it comes to a good hermeneutic. Like what questions are we asking of Scripture, and what are we expecting the Bible to answer? Um, and one of the things I've even noticed, like in my own preaching and teaching, is that a lot of the times I will let some sort of mass or public issue determine what answers I go to the Bible to seek. And I was reading Thomas Merton the other day, and he was concerned that sort of like a mass political sense of involvement in politics or religion was replacing a deep spiritual connection with God and our own personal development as human beings, and the development of the individual toward God. Um, and so I was wondering if you could maybe say something about that. Is that something that you've also kind of noticed, that we're letting our group life in, and even letting our group and political life determine more the questions that we ask of the Bible than we used to, and that we're reducing um, what is like a very spiritual set of ideas to very practical ideas? Maybe reduce isn't the right word, because we have tended to ignore practical concerns at different times and played them off. So I don't know, maybe we're trading some of the deep personal developmental spiritual ideas and aspects of the faith for really more practical concerns. And to me, it doesn't seem like it's a good trade-off.
Well, certainly the national political concerns have loomed very large and have a deep influence. And I think it confuses our priorities. Um, and there are often there are dishes on both sides of the road. And at times we can, I think, err too much in saying, well, the Bible has nothing to say, nothing to do with our
Yeah.
national life or everyday life. It's all inner and spiritual, so that's a danger on the one side. And then the other side is, I think, that we tend to see with often what is called Christian nationalism, is really confusing what is ultimate with what is penultimate. That
Yeah.
instead of God and even the church, we make our particular view of the welfare of the nation the most our ultimate concern. And place it our relationships about that. A number of people have commented that, like, so say in the 60s and the 70s, a big issue was what religion you are, what denomination you are. So they talked about, well, parents would be very concerned if a Baptist married a Catholic, or
Yeah.
Baptist married a Church of Christ, perhaps. Those were big issues. But now it's whether a Democrat marries a Republican,
Yeah.
or a Republican marries a Democrat. That is a much bigger issue.
Yeah.
And I think with you, well, there's something amiss there, something a little wrong with that, where that supersedes almost all other loyalties.
Yeah.
And then it divides people in the church, it divides friendships and over Christian brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
I did want to say that the issue of confirmation bias, or being biased, as you were kind of talking about when we go to the Bible, that affects all of us.
Right.
I'm not just talking about some people, or some people with a more literalist hermeneutic. All of us deal with that, and it's a challenge to all of us.
Yeah.
That's why having a good hermeneutic helps, because it helps ameliorate a bit that tendency to just go find what we want, go looking for what we want.
Yeah. I've had several people ask me, they'll say, well, you interpret it this way and these people interpret it this way, and what makes you think you're right? It's like, well, I think I'm right because I'm me, and I assume that I'm right because that's how our brains work. But if we want a good measure of interpretation, like you said, the Sermon on the Mount is pretty clear. It's really hard to actually do, but there's just about anybody could read the Sermon on the Mount and kind of get the gist of what Jesus is saying, except for maybe the pluck out your eye and cut off your hand part. Nobody wants to take that literally ever.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but for the most part, the way of being in the world that Jesus prescribes, I think, is pretty clear. And so, for just sort of church going Christians, I think if we can filter a lot of the rest of the Bible and maybe what we think the Bible is saying to us through the ethos of Jesus, and remember that we're followers of Christ, we're not followers of the Bible, whatever that even is. Um, I think that can make a huge difference. But uh, I also see like some disturbing trends in, you don't have to speak too specifically about this, but some disturbing trends in like Christian higher education, and in even the way the the church on the ground sort of approaches the whole education issue. I saw an article in the Atlantic, I think it was, where they talked about, I think they interviewed something like 400 different pastors of all different denominations that had been fired from their church or felt like they needed to leave because a large group of their church members had subscribed to QAnon and were part of the QAnon conspiracy. And I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the regular dynamic between a pastor and church people. And in a lot of, especially smaller towns, the pastor might be the most educated person that attends the church. And so, and he's usually not from that town. He's usually somebody that comes in from the outside. And so, right there, the education and not being part of the congregation in like a familial way, you can make pastors kind of naturally suspect. And then if you have a majority of your church congregation watching certain kinds of news and subscribing to theories like QAnon, and you have your pastor saying, no, we're not, that doesn't represent what the gospel teaches, there's like a natural place for a rift to occur. Um, but unfortunately, like a lot of seminaries draw their support from that sort of local church base. And I'm concerned that this is, again, me doing all my hand wringing and fretting, but I'm concerned that that tendency to be suspect of higher education and critical thought and alternative interpretive schemes, um, is going to lead to a reduction in the respectability and in the rigor of Christian higher education. We're going to end up with more and more people that don't even think that those issues are important. Not that they can't interpret the Bible critically, but that they don't even care to. And so my question is that something that's valid to worry about, and what could we do to fix it?
You're identifying quite a few things to worry about, and
Yeah,
I think they are real worries. We've sort of worked ourselves as a nation, the church, conservative churches, into a real fix. Some of it has to do with that hermeneutics and being very tied to it. And I should mention this: students who come, I usually always ask them, how were you brought up? What were your impressions as you grew up, and how to interpret the Bible? And still, almost everyone comes to Hardin Simmons anyway,
yeah,
with that hermeneutic. And so then they have to deal with it, and it can feel very strange. It can be scary. It can be
yeah,
threatening to change your hermeneutic,
right,
because it can feel like changing the Bible or changing or giving up on the Bible. And that can take a while to deal with. I think the higher education has a couple, they have a lot of issues that make it really difficult. And one of them is what you're talking about. There's always the issue of constituency: who's paying the bills, who's sending the
yeah,
students, the parents. And what if what you're doing is not exactly compatible
right,
with Ben? That's a big issue. Um, Another side, because of the economic problems, is there's such a strong push, essentially, to give up in a way on the liberal arts ideal, and just the
yeah,
concerns: come and get a job. I want my child to come, and even the children, the youth, come.
yeah,
I want to get something where I can get a job. And often that is so short-sighted. Like teaching philosophy, I'm pretty familiar with this. Probably most parents, if their young person comes home and says, I'm going to major in philosophy,
Right.
they're going to have a reaction. But the truth is, actually, philosophy majors in the long run tend to do better a lot of times than the ones going into the STEM programs. And that's true in a lot of the liberal arts areas in our society where jobs change a lot. I was talking with a guy yesterday who's in a job, and I said, well, how did, what did you major in to get that job? He said, well, it doesn't have much to do with what I majored in, but things changed, I adapted, and I learned, and now I have this good job. And a lot of times employers want someone who's a little broader than a very narrow focus. But even at places like Hardin-Simmons and all over, there's so much pressure to cut back on the liberal arts, put all the apples in one basket. And essentially, the concern I have is you end up being like, not to pick on them, but Texas A&M light or Texas Tech light. And they're good schools. They're great schools. It's just schools like Hardin-Simmons, the other Baptist colleges can do something that they can never dream of doing. And what's sad is to see them in a lot of ways giving that up to just try to be as much like Texas Tech as they can be. And I think that 50 years from now, who's going to be around? Texas Tech will be around. I'm confident.
Right.
I'm not as sure about the small private Christian liberal arts colleges who are trying to just, in a lot of ways, emulate those schools.
I saw a meme of all things the other day where I think somebody wrote on Twitter, how come in college we don't study our history and ask really hard questions and try to figure out broader solutions to human problems? And somebody replied to them and said, congratulations, you just created the humanities department.
Right.
As we're going into the beginning of a new millennium, and as we're dealing with the internet and how we process information and what it means to be a person, those questions are more important than ever before. And I don't know, I feel like there are a lot of people that are just kind of scared to get too deep into it. And so we're going to focus on STEM and on the things that we can calculate and the things that we can manage and understand, things that are proven to be profitable instead of things that have some kind of long-term ambiguity. And it does seem like, I don't know, maybe it's a bit of a fear response. People are putting their heads down and trying to work harder and just hoping that the asteroid doesn't hit.
Well, there's a lot to that. And in higher education, to be fair, there are a lot of schools that are facing severe financial challenges. And probably most of us know what that feels like in our personal lives. If our finances are bad, it can be pretty scary. And one of the things that I think that you dealt with in your thesis and as a part of spirituality is with all the brain studies and things that correlate with that now, is to point out that meditative prayer and so on strengthens the peace circuits, you could say, in our body and our brain and our self. And it dampens the fear circuits.
Right.
And when we're afraid, it's interesting, the brain scans that are taken when people are very afraid are fascinating. The parts of the brain that are very imaginative, the higher critical thinking parts of the brain are dampened down. The immune system is dampened down as well. So then you ask, what kind of decisions are we making when we're very fearful?
Yeah.
And we're not thinking well. We're not able to think very analytically. We're not able to be imaginative.
Yeah.
We may feel very pressured. I think we all have an idea what that feels like. But when you look at that, it's when we're driven by fear, we're probably not making very good judgments. And much of our society, higher education, so on,
Yeah.
there's huge amount of fear, I think.
That was so easy to just sort of play off before COVID. One of the things that has really kind of shocked me about the whole COVID thing is like my generation, we've grown up without any sort of major, there have been wars, obviously, and very long running and costly and painful wars, but we haven't grown up with any sort of wars between major powers in the world. They've all been proxy wars through smaller, and then this is our first like really serious global public health crisis that my generation has been around for. And so it's been easy my whole life to kind of play the importance of that fear response off as, that's something for people in the past who were less educated, um, who had less hope for the future. But with our technology and with our understanding of science and with um, our ability to solve problems and the medical advancements and the things that we've made, um, none of this should be that big of an issue. And it took about 24 hours for all of the grocery stores in my town to have their shelves stripped completely at the beginning of the pandemic last year. And then it happened again. We had a hurricane hit last year. And then we also had a big freeze, as you guys know, earlier this year. It happened 3 times where there was no gasoline at the gas stations and there was no groceries at the grocery store. And to me, that was a real eye opener that sort of fearful thinking and the direct consequences from that are so close to all of us, and that it's easy to think that they're not when we lived in a very sort of privileged time when things are going well. But that switch flips, and it is almost instant that we turn back into more of an animal self that's really concerned and really fearful and making very seriously selfish decisions. And so uh, I know that like if you're going to look at it as a hierarchy of needs, the the decisions we make on the ground in like a pandemic to protect our family is a much more base concern than the decisions that like a higher institution of learning would make when they're having sort of a budget problem. But the processes that are driving those decisions are basically the same, right?
And I think you can argue what's going on in our bodies, our brains
Yeah,
are pretty similar.
right.
Whether you're running to get the last bag of toilet paper,
Yeah,
or whether you're worried if the school might not make it another year,
yeah,
and maybe a year out. But right now, immediately, you can be the same things can be going on,
yeah,
and it's the same effect. And the thing is that that's so prevalent in our society, which is maybe somewhat ironic because most of the time, most of us are not facing immediate dangers.
right.
And to put in a good plug for our body's capacity to deal with fearful things, there is a place for that.
Yeah,
If you have an immediate attack or a car's bearing down on you, our
right.
bodies are designed to react quickly.
Yeah,
And you don't need all the higher thinking and imagination. You
right.
need all the energy and resources focused to escape that danger. And that's why we have that. But I think the typical thing, even in, let's say, hunter-gatherer societies, you have a danger and then you get over it.
Yeah,
You escape and then you're over it. And so then you're at peace, you're calm for a while.
yeah,
There's maybe another danger. But our society, we have $1 trillion industries of advertising and political campaigns and so on that they know that we respond to fear.
yeah,
It gets our attention. And so we're inundated with stimulation that
yeah,
stimulates our fear responses. And so as many point out, we can live in a chronic state of anxiety. And I mentioned earlier, it's one part of it that actually the immune system is
yeah,
dampened when we're stressed and anxious and fearful, because in an immediate danger, we don't need all the immune system. But what if you're chronically
yeah,
suppressing the immune system? But then that leads to all kinds of illnesses,
Yeah.
vulnerabilities. So that, I often think one of the best antidotes to that is prayer.
Yeah.
The kind of prayer that you looked at, and contemplative prayer, centering prayer, it really is to help us not be to be aware of when we're anxious, to be able to not be in an anxious state all the time.
Yeah.
And as many point out, there is a reason why one of the most common things that Jesus says in all the Gospels that we have is fear not.
Yeah.
That's another one of those things challenging to do.
Yeah, it's really easy to say. Can I ask you? So I know you as well as I do from your work and your notes on my papers and stuff that I turned into you, and you know me from stuff that I wrote. But we weren't ever in the same hallway. And so one of the things I've always kind of wanted to ask you about is your own personal spiritual practices and the way that you approach your spiritual life, and how that helps you follow the spirit, like we talked about earlier, and also mitigate some of the looming disaster that seems to overwhelm so many people. Because you've had some fairly serious changes happen in your life over the last few years, and you seem to have handled them well. So, what's your, if you don't mind, can you tell us a little bit about? I know it's personal, but can you tell us a little bit about the nuts and bolts of your relationship with the Lord?
Well, to put in another plug for prayer is good, and there's a place for all kinds of prayer.
Yeah.
But what is pretty fascinating is the way both the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church have appropriated, rediscovered, in a sense, or discovered the power of this kind of prayer, contemplative, centering, meditative prayer. And now, since about 2000, there have been huge amounts of studies of them that over and over show how healthy, health-giving, life-giving that practice is, as effective as medication.
Right.
For some, which is a strong message to a lot of people, which is not a word against medication when one needs it, but to show that it's as effective for anxiety, depression, trauma as medication.
Yeah.
So I've had a prayer life all my life. And the interesting thing is that I liked the what's often called the cataphatic kind of prayer, the imaginative prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not really drawn to this meditative form of prayer that could be called apophatic, or that's more stilling the mind and not having lots of thoughts.
Right.
And it really was a difficult kind of crisis about 10 years ago, when I came back from an extended time in Taiwan, and my body I didn't recover from the jet lag, which was a totally new thing. I'd never had trouble sleeping. I've traveled a lot, never had a problem. This time, my body gradually forgot how to go to sleep. And that created kind of a trauma and a long process. It took 1 full year of really dealing with stuff, and then about 3 years before getting back to more equilibrium. And one of the things I found in the middle of that, I started a practice of contemplative prayer every day. And at first, as sometimes people say, it made it worse.
Yeah.
because I had a lot of anxiety and stress from all of that. I was taking all kinds of medication.
Then you're thinking about whether or not you're doing the contemplative prayer thing right, and that could be
Exactly.
stressful. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're anxious about getting everything right
Yeah.
and then doing that, it actually made it worse, I would say. And I'm not even sure why I stuck with it. It's probably
Yeah.
because there were people who said this is really good. And I think in the end, that was probably maybe the most helpful thing
Mm.
in the longer term. And I've been very interested in embodied spirituality and embodiment before that, but it set me on more of a journey,
Yeah.
looking at the brain studies and the studies of prayer and so on. So it's really convinced me to seeing it in myself. Because I remember the one diagnosis I got from a counselor I went to was, you have an overactive amygdala. And anyone that's studied the fight or flight response knows the amygdala is the part of our brain that's the key to
Yeah.
all of that. And I was really struck by the studies that showed contemplative prayer.
Yeah.
Uh, it actually kind of reduces the size of the amygdala and the
Right.
parts of the brain that are calming. It strengthens those circuits. So it's not just right now helping me be less anxious. It's
Yeah.
doing it over and over makes it easier in the future. It's like
Yeah.
exercise,
Right.
essentially, like building a muscle. You actually get stronger. The brain is transformed, and here the psyche, the soul, the
Yeah.
spirit, then gets transformed. So
That's,
that's
I didn't,
that was personally true, and
yeah. I didn't know that about you. I have an autoimmune disease, and I started really looking into meditation once I started grappling with that. And one of the effects of mine is a lot of sleepless nights. And when you go through that, then you start to notice how many of the Psalms are written with David crying out to the Lord from his bed at night when he can't
mhm.
sleep. Like there's the the long-term effects of not being able to sleep well is also very damaging, and also causes the amygdala to be overactive and all that. And so I've definitely had ups and downs that I can directly tie to how much time and attention I was putting on my prayer life and my meditative life.
Yeah, there are a few just very basic things when you look at a lot of research on thriving or
Yeah.
resilience, things like that. But they're very basic, like meditative prayer,
Yep.
sleep,
Right.
exercise, and basically good food.
Yeah.
Those are huge.
Yeah.
Um, and sleep is, I just discovered and paid more attention to it after that, found out just how crucial that is actually to good thinking.
Yeah.
I know we had an honors student do a honors capstone project on
Hmm.
sleep,
Oh, wow.
and we were all kind of laughing or crying. It was hard to know which, but she was making the point that one of
Yeah.
the keys to good thinking, to be able to make good judgments and to process information well, is getting enough sleep. And someone commented, well, we're probably one of, at Hardin Simmons and McMurray and ACU, the most sleep deprived areas of the whole city.
Yeah.
That's one thing. Students tend not to get enough sleep. And I was thinking, of all the investment we put in education and the money and everything we pour into it to help people learn and think well, um, that we don't do that.
Yeah.
One of the things that has the greatest effect on it, we basically don't pay much attention to.
Wow. That is a theme that keeps coming up. That some of the fixes for our problems really actually aren't that hard, right? If everybody would just go to bed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, how do you feel that your spiritual life is tied in with your academic work? Um, the the idea of studying something deeply and writing a book about it, or teaching in college and things like that, um, it seems very sort of left brain, I think, to a lot of people. And for a lot of people, the spiritual side seems very right brain and a little bit more creative and imaginative. Um, for you, as an integrated person, how have those things kind of come together and work together and communicated with each other over the years?
Well, it's a very good question. And I think there's um, much larger role for the right brain, even in um, cognitive activities than we often
Hmm.
think. And this has to do, relates well to the theme of embodiment and so on, that even our left brain uh, thinking involves the body, it involves emotions that are related to it. So one of the things I think about is in like teaching or writing or just thinking about things uh, involves the imagination. It's not just the straightforward linear logical analysis, and there is certainly a great place for that,
Yeah.
but often there's this place for ideas, a place for the capacity to think of another angle, another
Yeah.
way to come at it. And that's, I think, more of, well, it's the imagination, but more of a right brain kind of thing. And I think about just the act of writing. When I first was writing research papers and things like that, it was very left brain. I'd write a sentence, get the source, footnote it,
Yeah.
and go to the next sentence. And it's pretty hard to get much of a flow
Right.
in doing that. And I actually learned, interestingly, from Hans Kung, this very famous Catholic theologian who died just a couple of weeks ago.
Hmm.
So it was a big deal for me. I had two different times studied with him, and he wrote a lot. Wrote theology books that were New York Times bestsellers. So he has a lot of credibility.
Yeah.
And he talked about when he wrote, he would study and get ready and get his main sources that he wanted, put just a few of them in front of him on a big table, and then he'd sit down and just write.
Mm.
He would just write uh, almost the whole thing,
Yeah.
as much as he could, and then he would go back,
Right.
and fix it all up, and that really helped me. And I think um, there was a book at one time that was about writing, right and left brain and writing, but I think of it as the actual writing process is more of a right brain process if
Hmm.
you do it that way. And then to come back and put in the footnotes and analyze it,
Yeah.
subject verb agreement, so
Right.
everything, too much passive voice or not, all of that, that's more left brain. But it's hard to do the creative work without the right brain. And I,
I mean,
yeah.
one of the things in grad school is like there's always a deadline for your writing. And so, you try to edit while you write, and there's nothing in the world that is less fun than trying to edit while you're trying to write at the same time. And so then it took me a while after graduating to kind of get back into the rhythm of being able to write without editing as I went. Um,
Right.
Especially when there's not a deadline, because the deadline will force you to do it. But if there's no deadline and you're just tripping yourself up over the same sentence over and over again, it does take a while to kind of relearn how to do that, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hmm. Are you writing anything now? Are you working on anything right now?
I've had more small projects, like some articles for some books in the Ricoeur series, the
Yeah.
series on the thought of Paul Ricoeur. I'm a co-editor of that, and
Mm.
um, I've done some chapters in books
Yeah.
like that, and papers, and things like that. I've been real interested, like you, in the issue of embodied spirituality or an incarnational approach to spirituality. And I'm supposed to do a paper over the next few weeks for the NABPR, the National Association of Baptist Professors of Religion, as a meeting
Yeah.
priest, and it's basically on embodied spirituality.
Mm.
And my goal is to do a book on spiritual discernment, uh, with embodied spirituality in the background. It's kind of the idea of spiritual discernment from the ground up,
Yeah.
or spiritual discernment on the ground, and look at it in light of the way that so often spiritual discernment has been seen as something very separate from the rest of life, or the
Right.
spiritual and the body are totally separate, or it's something that you kind of get zapped by, let's say in the more Pentecostal
Yeah.
circles, just a word from beyond. And I'm interested in the whole issue of, well, what's the role of the emotions and the body in practice and habits, getting better at something by doing it over and over. So
That's fascinating. I don't think anybody's quite touched that yet from an embodied standpoint that I know of.
so that's the thought.
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely look forward to that. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, and this is more a personal question. When I was in seminary, I felt like I was kind of, maybe not all the way up to date, but I was pretty close to up to date because of reading theological journals and things like that on what was going on in Christian academic life. And then the last 3 years or so since I graduated as just sort of a working pastor, there's not a lot of uh, I guess resources or contacts for that kind of thing. It's not the same as it is when you're in school.
Yeah,
Um,
true.
and I'm not planning on doing a doctorate, and something very drastic would have to change in my life for me to do that. But that academic side of my spirituality has been very important to my growth as a person. And so, do you have any advice for people like me for staying current with theological and philosophical issues so that we don't get left behind?
Well, it's hard for anybody to keep up with everything.
Right.
So some of it is to find the areas you're interested in and to keep reading.
Yeah.
And things that come out, and often the things that come out they'll mention other sources
Right.
for you, that you might want to follow up on. Well, I thought the journal we had at Logson, that Logson supported, the Review and Expositor,
Mm-hmm.
was a good journal along that line, because it touched on different topics pretty regularly, and was designed not just for academia.
Yeah.
So really with people like you in
Right.
mind. So that's there are not a lot of journals like that, because it was pretty broad too. It wasn't focused on
Yeah.
one area, but it tended over time to cover lots of areas.
Yeah.
Every issue would give kind of an overview of another issue.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's something like that. It's something to look at.
Mm.
But yeah, to keep the easiest thing to look for books that are kind of aligned with your interests,
Yeah.
that are coming out, and then they open up other things. And nowadays, of course, you can find perhaps blogs,
Right.
or podcasts or something like that
Yeah.
can help.
I don't know. It might just be me grousing about it, but there's part of me that wishes there were. Maybe there are, and I don't know of them. But part of me wishes there were some more high-level academic Christian voices out there, because there, in the podcast world, there doesn't seem to be. Again, I might be missing something, but that if I am, then that also points to the problem, right? Like we're not doing a good job of communicating. And I've always, like, since I started ministry, I've always felt like there's the conversation that happens at the academic level that very drastically affects the lives of church people, but they don't have any access to it, and they don't know that it's happening. You think about something like postmodernism just as an idea that affected the lives of everyone in the world, and it happened like nobody was privy to that conversation except for some philosophers at different universities, right? And that just kind of landed on everybody over the last 50 years or so. and it doesn't seem fair. It seems like there should be more transparency, more accessibility, but I don't quite know what to do about that problem. And I
That
don't
is a
know if
challenge.
people would be interested if even if that information was available.
Well, there is that. I think with nowadays there is a lot more overlap because there are the blogs and podcasts and so on. I was thinking, uh, I see Roger Olson's blog through
Mm,
Patheos, for example,
yeah,
and I find him pretty interesting. So if you
yeah,
find somebody like he's usually writing about somewhat popular things, but
yeah,
also theological issues. So if you find some people like that, uh, that and so it's a little more popular, a little more
yeah,
informal, but it's still getting um, introducing
right,
lots of issues, at least that he's thinking about.
yeah. Hmm. Well, I'll just have to keep looking then. I haven't been a member, but I want to join the Society of Biblical Literature because the annual meeting is in San Antonio this year.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
that would be great.
yeah. So
Another podcast, I don't know if you're familiar with it, is Homebrewed Christianity.
yeah, I've heard some of those. I think you were a guest on there.
Yeah, one time, but
Yeah,
he has a lot of people on
yeah,
that. If you like podcast kind of
right. Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for the tips.
things.
What's next for you professionally?
Oh, well, there was this big change with Logsdon Seminary. I'm been teaching this year, and I'll be teaching next year as well
Yeah.
for them to help teach out all the students. And then my goal is to teach several classes a year, and so um,
At Hardin Simmons?
well, if it's possible, that'll
Yeah.
be the question.
Right.
After next year, we'll see. I taught a doctoral seminar for B.H. Carroll
Okay.
here.
Yeah.
That was fun, and philosophy, theology, and then I'm checking with some other schools to see if there's some need.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty cheap labor now. And so we'll see how that works. A thing you would be very interested in, I think, is and maybe your audience is, I'm currently doing the 2-year living school program through Richard
Oh
Rohr's
yeah.
Living School of Action and Contemplation,
Okay.
and I'm about halfway through that. Um, we started just about the time of the pandemic, so
Yeah.
um, I'm I was supposed to go several times to Albuquerque, but
Right.
haven't made it yet. But I'm in 3 small groups out of that,
Yeah.
and then they have a curriculum, so there's a lot of online stuff and
Yeah.
discussion and some intensive. So uh, that's been really interesting, and a lot of that, it's not just him, but there's a Thomas Merton scholar
Yeah.
named Jim Kinley, Cynthia Bourgeot is very involved with it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot on mysticism,
Yeah, for sure.
and of course the great Catholic and Eastern Orthodox tradition,
Yeah.
which is what I wanted. I wanted to delve into that more. But I was going to mention to you one of the interesting people they had in, that was the biggest Zoom meeting I had been a part of back late last summer, about 300 people on Zoom. But one of the people they had participate for that, and I think is going to do more, is Barbara Holmes,
Okay.
who's an African American um, who has been a seminary president, seminary provost, uh, has written a number of things. She's very interested in science, interestingly, but
Yeah.
she especially talks about African American mysticism
Okay.
and African American. So she
Yeah.
feels like in the African tradition there is a kind of mysticism. It doesn't fit exactly the monastic
Right.
style. That's a little quieter, a little maybe solitary a lot of the
Yeah.
time. So she sees it as very much embedded in the life, what one thinks of as Black worship,
Yeah.
congregation life and community, but she sees it as a kind of mysticism.
Hmm.
And I found her pretty fascinating.
I am definitely going to have to check that out. I've never met anyone who's done the living school. And so, like, it sounds like you would recommend that if somebody has the opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was kind of a gift from Hardin Simmons when I decided to take the buyout. One of the big things that I hated about it was I had been approved to have a sabbatical, and
Oh,
part of the sabbatical was to do this school.
yeah.
And as it all worked out, they let me have the sabbatical.
Oh, that's great news.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I appreciate them very much for doing that.
Yeah. I'm glad you got that opportunity.
And it's been great. In a lot of ways, being cut off from the Hardin Simmons community that I had,
Yeah.
and the pandemic and everything, to have these small groups all wanting people, amazing people all over the
Yeah.
world, going deeper into spirituality. It has been wonderful.
And that's actually worked over Zoom.
Pretty well. Yeah,
Yeah.
these groups are small, six
Sure.
to eight people, and work pretty well.
Yeah.
I hope to meet some of them in person someday.
Right.
Yeah.
I had an idea of doing something like that with the audience for the channel. But like with most things that I do, I got kind of ahead of myself before I was really ready. And I hit the wall of like not having been part of something like that. And so not really knowing the ropes for it. But that is something that I think um, we would like to do someday in the future, is have groups of mutual support for people as they spiritually grow. Um, but again, also, as you know, that is kind of what the pastoral life is all about, and it does take the time that you have. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a limit to how much branching out
Mm-hmm.
somebody can do at a point like this. I mean, I have two young kids, and
Mm-hmm.
like I said, an autoimmune disease and a church that we're piloting through the pandemic, and so it might not have been time, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm glad that the testimony of it working electronically is good, because I've had some doubts about whether it's possible or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's been good, and I do hope, and I think we will be able to make a couple of trips, let's say to
Yeah.
Albuquerque, and be
Right.
all together.
Yeah. Cool. Well, is there anything else any more bones you want to throw to us?
Those groups have, and the whole school has been encouraging to me. I'm going back to the earlier discussion that we have a lot of problems. We have a lot of
Yeah.
divisions, a lot of polarities. Um, I think that we can miss the fact that, from what I can see in polls and surveys, that there's not as much difference in the country as we sometimes think. It's not evenly divided on most of those issues. It's 60 or 70%, are pretty much agreed. And actually, as the younger you go, the more there is agreement that we
Yeah.
have, even among evangelicals. So there's a lot of people out there, and these small groups have been encouraging to say, wow, there's a lot of people that they care about good hermeneutics, like we talked about, and they care about spirituality, they care about love, they care about, one of the big things in the Richard Rohr is the technical term non-duality.
Yeah.
But it means trying to overcome deep polarization. It's overcoming, it's just good over here and bad over here.
Yeah.
That the other person is all bad and your friends are all good. And over trying to overcome that. And it's never that simple, never that easy.
This
And
is
to
probably a
see
very interesting time to be working on non-duality, right? To be studying it and to be working through that.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Get a lot of practice.
Yeah, duality is having a really good season.
Yeah, that's right. A good way to put it. It's having
Yeah,
its day right now.
yeah. Hmm. Well, thank you, Dr. Stiver, for talking to me.
Well, you're welcome. I enjoy coming up here to my study and having chats like this. And it's really I loved what you did in your thesis, and it's really good to be able to sit down in a way and talk with you about these things.
I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.